Hello, my name is Azazel. I'm using a new microphone today and a new whole setup that costs like 40 bucks on Amazon, and I'm quite pleased with the results. Even though it is a cheaper microphone than than used in the last videos, it produces a much more desirable quality because it captures less mids in my voice and it doesn't sound as boomy. So I'm going to be using this mic going forward. So today we're going to be watching a classic video of Jordan Peterson versus a New Zealander professor. They're debating pronouns. And I'm just a sucker for this stuff because I think the idea of personal pronouns are so stupid and they fracture society. Now, I mean, that might be hyperbolic, but they have the potential to if legislation is passed, which it has been. Okay. We shall begin.
Well, it is a controversial topic on a Toronto University campus this month. Some people on the campus saying pronouns like he, she, him, or her do not represent them.
Here's the thing about pronouns. They're almost exclusively used out of your presence. Like when you're away, that's when people use them. He is over there. She is over there. She does that. It's used in a tense where the person's not actually there. I would never be addressing somebody in my presence as he. It doesn't make sense. I'd be like, hello, Joe, or hey, how you doing, man, and blah, blah, blah. So the whole idea of personal pronouns and being offended by them is rendered moot by that point.
Accurately. Now, the university wants staff to use alternate pronouns, but Jordan Peterson is a psychology professor at the university, and he is refusing to do that. Take a look at this.
Good. This was years ago.
The reason I'm defending freedom of speech is because that's how people
What an absolute
get their
legend.
opinions, settle their opinions in a civil society.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest?
Oh, he's a Nazi. He's a Nazi. That's what they fall back on. That's the insinuation here, right? If they knew anything about the man and they were honest in their discourse, they wouldn't ask this question, but they want to slander him as being a Nazi, which is the go-to when you lose an argument. You're worse than Hitler.
The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis. I'm speaking out the way I'm speaking out because I think this is a route to no violence. And violence is lurking. And you can say that that sounds like a threat.
There was no violence at our protest, though.
I just asked, would you refer to me if it wasn't for this law? And I asked you to refer to me with they, them pronouns, would you? And
No.
your answer was no.
Not if I was compelled to.
So just an example of how things have become heated at the University of Toronto. That scene showing different groups of students, some confronting the professor about his position, others supporting him. Now, Peterson says this is about free speech, but AWP...
That's exactly it. He is 1,000,000% correct. These people want to force you to say things against your will, right? You can't just... Here's the thing about identity. You can't just decide what you are. You're a product of your experiences. You can't just one day go or the next day you can't just change. You are the product in some of your experiences, and a huge part of your identity is the outside world and how others perceive you and how other people interact with you. It gives you an idea of who you really are. Because you may think you're the most wonderful person in the world and you might be delusional. Other people would be like, you're an asshole, and then they fight, those two ideas fight, and you come to whatever resolution. So it's not just I get to decide what I am and you have to respect that, because that's not a respectable thing and it's not in line with what's true.
Pete is also a professor at the University of Toronto who says that Peterson's language is abusive. Joining us right now is Professor Jordan Peterson as well as Professor A.W.P. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Professor Peterson, let's begin with you. Why are you against the use of alternate pronouns?
It's a good question.
I'm against the use of legislation to determine what words that myself and other people are required to utter.
Required.
But would you use alternate pronouns if a student asked you to?
I think I've made my position on that clear already.
Well, perhaps not.
For me, it would depend. If I had a really good relationship with a student, platonic, Like we really connected on some kind of mental level, and we really jived. I would be. I would support them in that if they wanted me to, but I would not do it for everybody because that would be insanity. Imagine trying to being a professor and having like 200 students in your class, and let's just say, for a hyperbolic example, that all of them have preferred pronouns. That's insanity. That's insanity. You're not going to remember a bunch of made up shit like that.
To our audience at home who are just being introduced to this, would you use alternate
No.
pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation. And when the words that are being required are the constructions, they're artificial constructions of people I regard as radical ideologues whose viewpoint I do not share.
He's so eloquent.
Well, we have a graphic to show our audience at home, just some of the pronouns being used or asked to be used as alternates. Among them you see here Z.
Let's just take a moment and look at this. Z, Zim, C, no, C, Z, Z here, Z, Zer, EM, no, sorry, AM, per. You're just making things up. You're just making things up. Oh my god, don't go against the tradition of just having a few things to refer to people. Because, like I said again, people can be delusional with who they think they are. And then they're gonna be like, what's a made up word? Blah 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 blah. That's my pronoun. Blah 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 blah. Come on. It just does not work. It overcomplicates everything, and it makes everybody walks an eggshell.
E or Zim, Z or here, Z or Zir, also hey, or A
Ridiculous.
rather, and per. So just some of the alternate pronouns there. Professor Pete, when you hear Professor Peterson saying that this is oppressive, how do you respond to that?
The Peterson drama has done real harm to
No, it
real
has
people
not.
on campus. He's
Nope.
made it harder to be transgender or
No, he has not.
non-binary. I know this from personal experience. I'm
No, you're pushing an ideology. Peterson is right.
non-binary and transgender, and I know how it's felt to be on the U of T campus for the last month.
This guy is a professor, right? He's one of the most... If you're going to assign privilege to anybody, it would be this person. A professor at U of T who's complaining people aren't using the right words to refer to him. Or to refer to his students. Like, are there any real world problems we can focus on?
And I also know from private communications with other affected people. In New Zealand where I grew up, academics have a statutory role enshrined in the Education Act to be a critic and conscience of society. So I think that's an idea worth exporting to Canada. So
A critic and conscience to society? No, how about, first and foremost, you approach everything with a rational disposition and see where that takes you in regards to being a critic with conscience towards society. If society says something is good, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Same with saying it's bad. Like the proliferation of this stupid garbage where if you don't use the proper pronouns, you get pulled in front of a tribunal.
I'd like to give Peterson about a B+ for his
How very condescending of you, Professor Shitbrain.
critic role recently, and an F for the conscience part.
I would give Peterson a triple plus because he knows what's really going on. See, universities are supposed to be able to, you're supposed to explore ideas that are uncomfortable or even contrary to what's popular, right? Like, let's say you lived in, let's say we were in the 1600s and the Catholic Church was reigning supreme, and the university, you were at a university and you're like, wow, what they're doing is really wrong, and you go against the grain, and you're allowed to because it's a real university and you're allowed to actually investigate. You're not allowed to do that with this shit at universities now. If you go into a class with a professor who's an advocate for social justice, and you say it's a bunch of bullshit in a paper, and you have cogent points and sources to back it up, that professor will do everything in their power to fail you or to ostracize you.
A student once said to me when I finally obtained tenure, "Now, Professor, now that you have obtained superpowers, you must agree to use them for good,
I don't like this person.
for peace and justice." So I invite Peterson to start doing more of that.
He has. He's done more good for the whole of society than anybody. Right? Because getting at what's true is the most important thing. And he has.
Well, Professor Peterson, those who are asking for this alternate use of alternate pronouns, they are saying it boils down to respecting their human rights. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it boils down to respecting their human rights. I think that it's an imposition on freedom of speech that's being implemented at a legislative level. I also think that if there was a
Correct.
naturally evolving solution to the linguistic problem that's being...
Do you see the difference between these two professors? One is an actual academic scholar, Peterson. The other is an agenda pusher.
imposed by a small fraction of the transgender community that
could tell
people would have
through their
already
language,
adopted
the
it.
use of their
We never had a
language.
situation in the usage of English before that required legislation to produce a transformation in the manner in which people spoke. Has a very dangerous precedent. So
Yes,
it's
it
one
does.
thing to tell
Very
people what they
slippery
can't
slope.
say. So, for example, we have legislation making it illegal to do such things as deny the Holocaust. It's a completely different thing to demand that people use certain words when they're formulating their own ideas. And it's also absurd. I mean, here's one thing that's happened that I don't believe the formulators of this legislation ever foresaw. So, in New York City, for example, there are now 31 protected gender identities.
31 protected gender identities, including the ones that are in common use, he, her, or whatever. 31. Do you know how insane that is? You could just start slapping on gender identities to whatever you see fit.
And I see no reason whatsoever why each of those gender identities can't demand the use of their own pronoun. And absurd things like that have been happening on the University of Michigan campus, for example, where students have been given permission to tell faculty members and others what pronouns they're to be addressed by, and they're multiplying rapidly out of control. So the law is bad from an ethical perspective. It's sloppily written, and besides that, the solution that it imposes is practically untenable.
Agree
Sorry,
with everything.
excuse me for jumping in, but I want to bring in Professor Pete here because we did show those words to our audience at home, and perhaps the control room can show it to our audience once again. When you look at those alternate pronouns, I think it's fair to say that some people will see that at home and see that as very unwieldy, if you will. What do you say to those types of criticisms, including the one you just heard from Professor
I want to hear
Peterson?
this.
Well, I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse. You know, we call
It's always nice to be kind. He's right here with that one statement. Be kind to people.
somebody what they want to be called in our society. For instance, I don't call somebody Julie if they prefer to be called Jordan.
No, you call them by their name and what they're known by. If their name is Jordan, and if they were born with the name of Jordan, or they legally changed their name to Jordan, then yeah, and the other person knows that they changed their name, it would be disrespectful to call them a different thing, right? But that's their name, not their pronouns. As I stated earlier, your pronouns are used outside of your company when you're not there. So it shouldn't matter.
That's just basic human courtesy. Here's a great little tip for people who are
This is not gonna
despairing
be a
at
great
the
little
possibility
tip. It's
of
not.
remembering all those pronouns. What I do is just program in the pronoun next to the person's name in my smartphone.
Oh, cool. So you have like 200 students, and then a student comes up to you, and every time you want to speak to Zim, Z, or Zoom, blah, blah, you have to open up your phone and be like, what is their pronoun? Do you see how it complicates things? You know,
So whenever I'm out and about and I've forgotten whether one of my trans friends uses Z or Zer or they or them or something else, I just look it up and it's really super easy.
and there's something that I can't remember who said, but being too kind is destructive. Being too kind is destructive. There's a golden mean that you have to follow with kindness, right? You have to reject the unreasonable, right? Which this is. Yeah, but you still be kind. You're still kind. You see Jordan Peterson talking about this. He's never unkind about his disposition. He's just assertive about his point. You know, there's a difference between kindness and supplicativeness towards an ideology, which this is. I have to program all these different words into my phone now for all the students I have and all the people I know, because I have a very large trans circle, I'm assuming, for him. No.
One thing I'd like you to really look at in regard to this controversy is to watch out for who's getting centered in a discussion. Political correctness is code that powerful people use when they're annoyed that they're actually not the center of attention. And
Wrong. Political correctness is a term used to describe the overarching metastic, was it? I think it was a Frankfurt school of critical theory that had their tendrils locked into different things early on in the 50s or something. I think I read something about that. It's something much more deadly towards society, and you can see that with the natural consequences of like Antifa and all the rioting, destroying people's fucking lives and livelihoods. People were murdered, just general destruction, pulling down statues and trying to erase history. All these things are very destructive. So he is wrong.
in any given discussion. And Bill C-16 is actually not about cisgender people. It's about protections for transgender people.
Protections against what? Somebody uses the wrong pronoun, you're not even there. He is over there. Oh yeah, she likes to work in the blah industry. Oh, my personal pronouns are zer. You know how cunty that comes off if you're in the middle of a discussion and they cut you off to say, my personal pronouns are this. Nobody's going to want to associate with you because you're being rude. Who cares? You let it slide because it's really, you should be comporting with what is good for the society and using what Kant's categorical imperative, where if you do a thing, it should be good if everybody else does it too. And I know that's a very simplistic, reductionist viewpoint of his imperative, but that's what essentially it is. From an ethical standpoint, something is only good if everybody can do it and everything is fine. And so if everybody's using and made up fucking words, it's not going to be good because it overcomplicates everything, and you have the potential of even losing your livelihood by having to pay $250,000. If I had to pay $250,000, I'd be ruined. They'd have to send me for jail for non-payment of whatever fine it is. So I'd go to jail and lose my freedom because I didn't say some person's preferred pronouns. Get fucked.
And that's not, it's not about Jordan Peterson. So, we should have people learning to listen more. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a very good reason.
He's trying to refer to a Stoic thing. I think Epictetus said. I might be wrong. Correct in the foundation of that quote, but incorrect in this application of it. No.
When things get political, I like to ask who benefits and who gets to decide the rules of the game.
Who benefits? Let's see who the laws are made for in this game. It's certainly not for people who are proponents of free speech.
So, mostly with this Peterson controversy, which is really just a small drama, a tempest in a teapot.
No, it's not a small drama. It's something critically fundamental to the freedom of expression in Canada. Critically fundamental.
He could just get over learning to program a few pronouns into his phone. By the way, I only have...
He has a principle that he's trying to uphold, you fool. You understand that, but you're trying to get around it. I know you're not that stupid.
Half a dozen or so that I actually use on an everyday basis, so it's not all that difficult. And I think
it's not the point of the difficulty, it's the point of the principle.
All right, Professor Peterson, good job, because I think Professor Peterson wants to
This video is going to be long.
Yeah, well, kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say.
There you go. That's beautiful. That should be on a poster somewhere. Yes, kindness is a veil used to try and control people who are trying to exercise their freedom of speech. Right? You're not kind enough. You're a monster. You're bigoted. You're transphobic for not using my pronouns. How dare you? And it shuts them up because society will then shame them or they'll be canceled. or what have you. Oh, Peterson is on point.
So, if we're bandying back and forth our differences in values, I would say that the highest possible value is truth, and that one of the concomitants
He's
is
a real
that
professor,
is that
ladies
we
and
need
gentlemen. Truth.
stringent protection for freedom of
Truth.
speech so that we can utter the truths that we see fit. And I think that that's a value that's much
Oh,
higher
wait, I
than,
just did a
than
hate
kindness,
symbol.
for example. I mean, there's lots of situations in life where kindness in the immediate present is not the appropriate way to react at all.
But
So, for
Professor,
example, when you discipline children, you often hurt their feelings in the short term so that they can learn to behave properly.
Yes, yes. If you're too kind and you just let your child do whatever they want, they're going to turn into a piece of shit.
In the medium to long term so that their lives go well. And so this automatic assumption that the people on the social justice warrior side of the equation are motivated only by kindness when they're also clearly motivated by power is something.
Yeah, that's correct. Why doesn't the whoever the other guy is say the truth? We want power. We want control. We want control over what you say, and if you don't do what we say, we're going to put you in jail and take away your freedom.
Something I find completely untenable. And I don't think that Pete's solution to program my cell phone so that I can remember what names people need to be called is a reasonable solution at all. We're actually supposed to now use electronic devices to bolster our ability to speak freely
How do
in
you
case
remember
we
names,
offend
Jordan?
someone.
Is it so difficult to remember a pronoun? You remember somebody's first
it
name, you
is.
remember their telephone.
Yes, it is very difficult to remember people's pronouns because they're all made up, they're all different, and there's 200 of them in your class. He's a professor.
Number. I mean, I think that it's
I don't
very,
remember
very
people's
true
first names
that
very easily, and I don't remember their telephone numbers very easily. And when I see a stranger, I call them by the pronoun that seems to be in accordance with their presented appearance. And
that's you
There you
being
go. There
lazy,
you go.
Jordan. That's you being lazy. I think there's
No, that's him being reasonable and comporting with inductive reasoning, which is what we all use to navigate the world.
very high value that we should also be aiming for in addition to truth. By the way, throughout this whole controversy, I have told the truth at every turn.
No, you have
so,
not.
Trying to imply that that's not what's happening on people on the social
No, you're not in search for truth, you're in search for power.
justice. Am I a social justice warrior? I don't know.
Yes, you are.
But I
Yes.
think that we should be aiming for pluralism. This means recognizing more than one set of fundamental principles, fostering
No, because if you have two sets of fundamental principles, and they're fighting each other, that's no good.
independent cultural traditions of minorities and being willing to share power with people who are different than you.
No. You're not willing to share power. You're like Sauron. Sauron does not share power. You want it all.
I think if you just stop centering this whole controversy on yourself and how hard it is for you to accommodate genderqueer people, well, have a little bit of sympathy. I mean, those of us...
He's a psychologist. He has more sympathy than any person probably in like a 50-mile radius. And you could tell by the way he speaks to people. He speaks to people with respect all the time. I've never seen this guy disrespectfully address somebody or call them names or anything derogatory like that. The guy is a legend.
Us who are trans encounter much more greater indignities every day and every week of the month.
Yeah, much more greater indignities. Correct, like being assaulted. I know. I've heard these things. Though that's a much more serious issue than not calling them by the preferred pronouns. Right?
For example, have you recently had a bank employee accuse you of trying to masquerade as yourself at a bank and then
What?
locking down your ATM card and credit card so that you can't use any money?
No, I've never heard of that. That sounds like something that they would be fired over. Right?
Those are the sorts of problems that trans people face every day, being out of housing, being considered, considering suicide. These are...
Yeah, he's correct about that. There's a very high suicide rate with trans people. I don't know a lot about trans people, but I've heard of that, and it sounds tragic. But not using their pronouns is very milquetoast. So you're not going to conflate that to add to their suicidality. Come on. Stop it, you melodramatic professor, you.
really big problems.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Problem, isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans.
What do you mean that's the problem? What kind of sentence was that?
People, and they tell me that the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people
Jordan,
actually want it to be referred to as he or she.
Here we go. Just because you have a few trans friends doesn't mean that all trans people do the thing. You know what? I hear that more often than not, even with like the Black Lives Matter movement, that black people don't support them in general because of they act stupid, infantile, immature, and they do stupid shit all the time that gets nothing of substance and value done to actually help their communities. So it's the same thing I think here with the radicals trying to push an agenda. Trans people just, I think, want to be left alone and live their lives. They don't want to be put in the spotlight and vilified because of these small group of radicals who are making them look like social justice warriors, right?
Mean
they
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
Untransphobic.
They
just
weren't
because
my
you
friends.
know a few people, just because you've talked to a few trans people.
He probably gets like hundreds of emails from different people he doesn't know who identify as trans that say you're completely right. I'd love for him to have been prepared. He probably didn't. It was an impossibility. He couldn't have known that this other professor was going to say that. But it would be lovely to have seen him prepared with like all the emails he got with the redacted information of the people who sent it. It's like, these are all the people, and it was like 500 emails saying, thank you, Professor, for defending free speech and free expression in Canada.
You don't know the trans community like the trans community does. You've got no idea what it's like to be trans.
Professor Pete, Professor Pete, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
Yeah.
All right. So, the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Correct. And this goes for any activist, right? BLM, Antifa.
Nobody elected you either, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself, and on behalf of other people, perhaps who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, and so I'm not taking.
But Professor Peterson, let me jump in there though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use
not
anymore.
Not by legislation.
An evolution of language, like what? The change of the definition of racism from being discriminatory based on race, so elevating your own race over another person's and being discriminatory against them. That was the classic definition. Now, anything is racist, right? If, let's say I say a mildly racist joke, and me and the other person are in an understanding that it's funny, like the racist jokes are funny. They understand, and then there's another person who doesn't know that, who comes in and jumps in and says, "You can't say that." Who the fuck are you to tell me what I can and can't say? You know? That's the point of comedy, to broach dark subjects that are uncomfortable to talk about. That's one of the beautiful things about comedy and jokes, whatever.
Legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental.
It shouldn't matter. It really shouldn't matter.
That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether legislated or not?
I understand
I understand legislatively, but if at the heart of it is to allow a student to study free of what they feel is discrimination, why not help that?
Holy fucking shit. If you're a student going to a university, you go to class, you learn the material, you go home, you do the homework, and you ad nauseum until you graduate. That's your responsibility and obligation. That's the whole point of going to a university, right? All this other shit, don't be an activist. Focus on your studies and get the hell out of there.
That along.
I already made my case for why not help that along. I believe that this legislation is extraordinarily dangerous, and there's other elements of it too that we haven't even got to in our society yet, like the protection for gender expression. And I've looked at gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code, and as far as I can tell, gender expression is best summarized in a single word: fashion. No. Because it's the way that you present yourself in public with your clothing and your manner of dress. And so I also think that the legislation that we are bringing forth with Bill C-16, and that's already in place in places like Ontario, also makes fashion criticism something akin to a hate crime. And
A hate crime. Imagine being like, the colors don't go together and blah blah blah, and then you get pulled in front of the Human Rights Tribunal. Oh my God.
because there's been so much noise about the identity component of this, we haven't even talked about gender expression. This is appalling legislation. And the idea that referring to someone by the pronoun of their choice is going to radically improve their status in society or their mental health is a completely unproven assumption. I think it'll have exactly the opposite effect.
Professor Pete, I want to ask you, because it's been brought up a couple of times, to Professor Peterson's point, if this was so popular, if this was so needed, there would be a natural evolution. There wouldn't be need for legislation. Why the need for legislating this as opposed to allowing it to evolve naturally?
Oh, please.
Well, Bill C-16 and the Ontario Human Rights Code do not actually legislate pronoun usage. They don't specify 31 genders or anything of the kind.
But let me jump in, though. The university is essentially telling, at this point, its human resources people to use alternate pronouns, in a way legislating their staff to do this.
The legislation also requires that the university made clear their concordance with that assumption on my part by mentioning in the letter that asked me to silence myself that I'm required to act in accordance with the provisions of the Ontario Human Rights Act. And so the university knows full well that the legislation does precisely what I suggest it does. It's not written precisely in Bill C-16, it's written in the Ontario Human Rights Code. And if you read the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies on such things, you'll see very rapidly that utilization of preferred pronouns is part of the legislative package.
Oh my God, this guy is an absolute monster when it comes to argument. Absolute monster. He's on such a higher level than the other professor, whatever his name is. A.W. Pete. He's on such a higher level. He speaks so much more eloquently and academically on the subject. Pete is just feelings.
So and they're actually, if you read the legislation, Jordan, you will find out that they're actually called correct pronouns. There's no preference about this.
There is
on the
Ontario Human Rights Commission website where the policy is laid out. And if people don't believe that, they can just go look themselves.
Professor Pete, when you hear that this is a free speech issue, that you hear Professor Peterson in this case essentially saying that he doesn't want to be legislated to adopt new language, what's your response to that?
Yes.
Well, I share a number of Jordan's concerns about freedom of speech and academic freedom on campus. These are both very, very important principles, and they should apply regardless of what kind of politics you like.
But...
For example, if you're a left-winger or a right-winger or an up-winger or a down-winger or whatever it is. But you know, the reason why we have
there's a but there, I knew it.
Laws that protect academic freedom and freedom of speech is primarily to prevent government interference in individuals' lives, in their business.
It's an enlightenment value. It's an enlightenment value. It's a value that universities are built on so that they can ascertain what's true, what actual knowledge about the world. You're dancing around the subject. The subject is a principle. I know Peterson is talking about legislation, but something more fundamental is the principle of the enlightenment value of being able to have honest discourse and trying to discern the truth.
It's there really mostly to protect against a form of structural violence.
Whoa, structural violence. What's violent? What's violent about not using people's preferred pronouns? What's violent about that? I thought violence was action, like if I punch you in the face or destroy your car. Not Z's or Zim or, oh, whoops, I used the wrong pronouns, now it's violent. Stupid.
These free speech laws were actually never intended to be used as all-purpose accountability shields, you know, so that you don't have to be held accountable for your actions.
I'm perfectly willing to be held accountable for my actions, and the university has already indicated the seriousness with which they view my actions. And I also do not believe that free speech laws were there to protect, to regulate violence. Free speech laws are there because we use free speech to identify problems in our society, generate solutions to the problems, and then reach a consensus. So freedom of speech is actually is protection for the mechanism by which our individuals and society properly orient themselves across time. It's not even a principle, it's the fundamental method by which our societies manage to maintain the stability that they do maintain.
Man, I love this guy.
And so
It's one of the ways we do that, yes.
It's the most fundamental way. It's the most fundamental way. What other ways do we do that? What other ways do we do that? Please elucidate further, Professor.
well, I would say that it's the fundamental
no?
way. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think we could have a reasonable discussion about that, but because freedom of speech is so tightly tangled up with the means by which we solve problems. I mean, I think, and then I talk, but I get corrected when I speak publicly. And the fact that I'm being corrected constantly by the people that I'm speaking with helps orient my speech properly and helps orient public discussion properly. And I can tell you, too, that if there wasn't something absolutely vital at stake here that had a lot more to do than with just simple kindness, there wouldn't have been millions of people watching, for example, the assault that took place during the free speech rally that was held a few days after I released the video, which I see that CBC conveniently omitted to include in their video clips at the beginning
Yeah, CBC is going to CBC.
of this interview.
Well, Professor Peterson, we do want to thank you. We're sorry we're out of time here.
You should thank him more because he's such a wonderful speaker and he's so immovable from his position. It's fantastic to see and refreshing in the absolute shit heave of modern society. Anyway, that's a long video. Oh my god. All right, how long are we here? Jeez.